We're rolling. So good morning. Good morning on the West Coast, and good afternoon, everybody else. And I'm really glad to be here with you today. My name is Larry LaMotte. I'm the CEO of ReCapturit. I'm your host today. At ReCapturit, we are the passionate stewards of salvage, extending the life of building materials and buildings with three things. We've got the solution to construction waste and overflowing landfills. We have the place to shop for and sell treasures of recaptured building materials, and help for cities to craft clear and effective reuse policy, obviously today's topic, and that's the DPA, the Deconstruction Policy Accelerator. So yeah, we are entering into the zone of planning and policy with cities and counties across the USA, and I'm joined here by two gentlemen that know a lot more about that than I do, but that's why they're here. This webinar is the first in an ongoing series of webinars, workshops, and day-long boot camps that we will provide to educate, inform, and hopefully even inspire city officials to understand the need to move toward deconstruction from the total demolition and disposal of buildings. And each event's going to build on the others. The workshops and the boot camps will get into much more detail and how to. This webinar will be practical. It's introductory. It's a conversation with these two exceptional experts about the incredible option to the single largest waste producing set of practices in the world, construction and demolition waste. And the one key thing that can be done to stop that, deconstruction of dead buildings. So with that, let me say, we'll share that. Okay, so let me adjust things here briefly. All righty. Well, these two incredible experts with us today, Ted Rife and Shawn Wood. They're going to share their experience with you, and at the end, answer some of your questions. You can put those questions into the chat here if you like. Shawn Wood is formerly the construction waste specialist with the city of Portland, Oregon, and he's the leader of Portland's landmark deconstruction policy, and he's now working with the US EPA as the low carbon building materials advisor. And Ted Rife, Ted is the founder of the Reuse People. It's one of the largest sellers of used building materials and architectural salvage in California, and they have licensees all over the US and in Canada. Both of these men have been featured speakers at conferences. They've published content all over the place on many topics. They've got decades of experience, and they are giving their time generously in the pursuit of less waste. So here's something I want you to remember. Remember this: waste is not waste until it is wasted, right? Okay, so let me go there. All righty. Gentlemen, greetings. Let's start with Ted Rife. You and your organization have taken down a building or two, or building or 200, or a lot in deconstruction over the past 25 years. And while deconstruction of buildings is not new, it is not a common practice in today's world. So Ted, would you please describe for all of us here today how deconstruction differs from the most common practice today, which is demolition, and what's deconstruction for, and why should we care what happens with materials when buildings die, and why should we change? Ted.
Thank you, Larry. Glad to be here. And yeah, I think you said that this was non-compensatory. Gee, I didn't know that. Forget it. That's a joke.
Oh, Ted.
Okay. Anyway.
Count on you, buddy. I can count on you.
Yeah. Yeah. The original, to me, the original and still ongoing problem with deconstruction is we have been so related to recycling, and people just tend to mix those two up completely. And what do I mean by that? All right. When a building comes down historically over the last hundreds of years, what happens to them? It goes to a landfill. In the 60s, 70s, 80s, more prominently, a lot of that material gets recycled. And consequently, that recycling has become the go-to place to take materials. Nothing wrong with recycling, except as one is opposing it to reuse. The reason being that recycling simply takes more energy. because we've got to change the form of whatever that material is, plastic, iron, steel, bricks, concrete, whatever. It all has to be more energy has to be added to it, and consequently, that's not the case with reuse. With reuse, we're not adding more energy. And this has been proven by many studies that have gone on over the years. I think one of the first ones was 15, 20 years ago by the laboratory at Wisconsin. And so consequently, the main benefit of reuse becomes absolutely saving the energy. But more than that, landfills are being filled up, and those can be problematic, and we have to recite landfills. The cost and the impact on communities of new landfills is horrendous. So certainly saving landfills is a key element. Saving the energy is a key element. And more importantly, frankly, deconstruction is only one side of the equation. There has to be customers coming out the other side. And the interesting thing about it is we have been using and selling and buying used and double used and triple used cars since 1908. And we're very used to that. We're very used to thrift stores. But for some reason, and again, I kind of blame it on the recycling mentality, that people just don't put us in the same category and see the additional benefits for it.
Yeah. Gotcha. Those are very good points. Thank you. That the have to have the customers, and the reuse is definitely better than recycling. So thank you, Ted. Okay, we're over to you, Shawn. Shawn Wood, since you led and largely developed the first in the country and the landmark legislation in Portland, Oregon, to advance deconstruction and to diminish a portion of the wasteful practice in the world, the biggest wasteful practice in the world. Would you please give us a view of where deconstruction fits within the whole ecosystem and the late life cycle of whole buildings currently? Where does it fit in that whole mix?
Sure. So first, I just want to say thank you, Larry, for having us here today. It's great to be here with you and with Ted, and thanks to everybody for joining. And Larry, thanks for all you do to advance deconstruction and material reuse.
You're welcome.
All right, I'll answer your question now. In terms of the life cycle of a building, it's a series of stages that each have their own set of impacts. So I look at it as, it's the life cycle of a building starts with design, then it moves into material selection and production. So those have their own set of impacts. There's the actual construction of the building and the impacts associated with that. There's the use of the building, so operational emissions later in the building's life. There's remodeling and maintenance. And then ultimately, when the building reaches the end of its life, there's several options. And the primary option that most people think about is demolition, right? Let's smash it. Let's spread a bunch of dust. Think about like HGTV and how, the big thing right before they go to a commercial is somebody with a sledgehammer getting ready to smash a set of cabinets. Like those shows drive me nuts. They don't wear masks and they just like smash everything. So anyway, kudos to everyone that's here in the webinar today, because you're interested in other options besides just smashing things. And there's several options at the end of a building's useful life. In order of preference, preservation first. You want to try and keep the building. Relocation is a second. I mean, buildings can actually be moved, and used to, I think, be a lot more common than it is today. Deconstruction's kind of your third best option, and then a distant fourth is mechanical demolition. So assuming keeping the building or relocating it isn't feasible, and the building has to come down, again, most of the time people think about demolishing it and crunching it up. And a little kind of piggybacking on what Ted was talking about, the put this in perspective about how much waste is generated when we lose a building that way. Across the country, construction and demolition waste makes up about 40 to 50% of the waste stream. Here in Portland, where I'm from, it's around 35%, but certainly in other parts of the country, it can be a full half of their waste stream. So it's a significant amount. It is more than municipal solid waste. And of that 40 to 50% number, 90% of that waste is related to demolition activities. So it's a good play. If you can crack the nut on demolition waste, you've solved a big part of that problem. And if a building, what's that?
Big time. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh yeah. And I kind of like, I always think of it like a building is like a soccer game, and deconstruction is the goalie. It's the last line of defense. And deconstruction is, it's different from mechanical demolition. It's the disassembly of a building in roughly the opposite order it was constructed. And the primary purpose is to maximize salvage of materials for reuse. And I'll emphasize that again over recycling, because it's just not recycling, it's reuse, and you preserve all that embodied carbon and energy that went into manufacturing that material in the first place. So while there's benefits to keeping materials out of landfill and not letting it rot and produce methane, this again is kind of going back to what Ted said. I mean, the bigger opportunity in terms of impacts is reusing that material so it offsets the need to extract new materials and fabricate them and process them and ship them and install them. We've already realized those impacts with salvage materials. So when we talk about low carbon building materials, low embodied carbon building materials, salvage material is one of the best.
Excellent. Excellent. Wow. Thank you. Thank you. That does give us good context for it. Let's see. Over to you again, Ted. What happens to the materials typically when buildings are demolished? Where do they go? And then following along with that, what does changing that mean for us all?
When we first looked at this, our first dip into salvaging material was strictly on the donation side, and was donating it to the flood victims down in Tijuana in 1982-83 winters, or 92-93 winters, and the storms were just tremendous. So that was our first dip into it, was helping the lower income people. And since then, that's been pretty much of our mission. The materials that we have are not, some are what we would call architecturally significant, a stained glass window, a clawfoot tub, that sort of thing. But our main emphasis is on utilitarian items: doors, windows, cabinets, sinks, lumber, that sort of thing. And consequently, where we've always located our facilities are pretty much within lower income neighborhoods, where budget-minded families can come and don't have to spend $200 for a door at Lowe's, but they can buy it for $20, $25, $30 at our place. And that's been our focus. So I think that the main emphasis is, again, it's like a thrift store, as I mentioned earlier, just for used building material. And people can save the hundreds and thousands of dollars. Beyond that, the other financial advantage is on the other side. Those materials come from people who are taking their houses down, remodeling them, or completely deconstructing them and building something new. Typically, today's economy, anybody who's capable of doing that is in an income bracket in which their taxes are fairly high. So as a nonprofit organization, all the materials coming to us represent a tax-deductible donation, which encourages more people who are doing remodels and replacement of their homes. It gives them an economic advantage to them as well. The quantity of materials that we have through those last almost 30 years of business has been over 450,000 tons. And we do have those other materials, like I mentioned, the clawfoot tub and the stained glass window. But again, they're still priced at prices where people can reasonably afford them. And to me, that's the key. Whether it's a for-profit or nonprofit, the key is volume in, and consequently, it has to be volume out. Again, there have to be the buyers and the reusers of those materials. So the more that can be fostered, the better it is.
That's true. That's what we're working on. Absolutely. So I'm with you on that. Thank you. So would you, you got a couple of minutes left on, so would you do a little spin-off of this and talk about the future you see, because you're expanding out beyond residential deconstruction into commercial deconstruction, bigger buildings, different materials. What do you see happening in that realm, and why are you moving into there?
Well, the reason to move into it is fairly simple. There are more materials, weight-wise, volume-wise, coming out of the commercial sector than there are of all the demolitions of all the residential houses in the country. It's a substantial amount of materials. Now, I grant you that concrete is one of the largest of those, especially in buildings that have been built in the mid 20th century. And that is getting recycled, but we're looking at all the other items, including things like furniture and some fixed assets, windows, doors, carpet tile, ceiling tile, light fixtures, interior stud walls, that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. So the reason we're dipping our toe, well, more than dipping our toe, I think we put almost whole body into it this year. We've got 7 projects right now that we're working on commercial in various stages. And the quantity of materials is horrendous. And again, the other side of that equation, who's going to use them becomes the other.
Right.
One of the biggest problems that we face in the commercial business is the policies of and rules on building material, fire codes, for instance, on doors. That door was allowed 10 years ago, but it's not allowed today. Changing of panic hardware is different today than it was 20 years ago. So one of the problems we have is looking at the industry as a whole, and how do we reconfigure some of those policies and allow more materials to be reused in those buildings.
Right.
Certainly those policies exist in the residential side, but very frankly, when somebody's doing their own work, putting in their own door, putting in their own light fixture, those policies are basically ignored and not followed. But not so in the commercial business, just because of the liability.
Right. Right. Good. Well, thank you for that. Thank you for extending that into there, because I'm excited that you're into the commercial space now, because that's a whole new frontier in itself. Yeah. So Shawn, over to you. Speaking of policy, there's kind of 2 schools of bringing a policy into a city or a region, and one is by having the policy makers, the city council, the aldermen, so forth, come up with their idea of what should happen. They write it and they get it passed to be implemented and adopted and put in place. And then they announce to the public that that it is now active and they must conform to the new policy. Or you do what you did in Portland, which is different. Your approach was to understand that any such change to a universally established practice, like building demolition that's been in place for more than a century, changing that's going to impact the lives and livelihoods of thousands of people and affect changes literally decades beyond the starting point. So you chose instead to involve the stakeholders into the conversation early. Can you please tell us why you chose to do that, and who they were, and what that meant for the creation and the adoption and the the acceptance of that policy, please?
Yeah, no, great question, Larry. And boy, that first option sounds like a lot easier pathway, at least initially.
Yeah.
But less painful, but you're just delaying the pain. So no, we went the second route, and I guess I'll say that one of the things that influenced me was having been part of what I would offer is maybe kind of it's a third option that's in between the let's just cram this down people's throat and the let's get everybody in the room. And that's where you have a room, but it's filled with friendly stakeholders. And I had seen an example of that play out right before we formed our deconstruction advisory group. So go back like 2014, Portland was coming out of the Great Recession. The development community was going gangbusters. Houses were coming down left and right, and they were getting replaced with, for the most part, larger, much more expensive houses. There was some increased density, but at least at the time, most of it was just one-for-one housing coming down. And our neighborhood groups saw that happening in their neighborhood. So back in 2014, you could come in and apply for a permit to demolish a house, and you would have it issued over the counter. You could go back that afternoon and completely demolish that house. And, the neighbor next door would come home from work and what on earth happened to the house next to me? So imagine that climate. Imagine this was right around when Flint was finding out it had awful amounts of lead in the water system. So there were concerns around lead paint. There were concerns around loss of scale and character of neighborhoods, concerns about the waste. Anyway, all of that translated into our permitting bureau, which was separate. I worked for the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, but our permitting bureau was charged with a directive from City Council to review demolition regulations and come back to them with recommendations on how to fix the system. And so our permitting bureau formed a committee, which was really a subcommittee of another committee that was primarily comprised of frequent permit applicants, developers, and permit review staff. I knew that was coming. I knew this subcommittee was getting formed. If we were going to talk about demolition regulations, I saw it as an opportunity to advance deconstruction. So I literally invited myself to this subcommittee meeting. And so it was me, permitting folks, either on the city side or kind of frequent flyers in the permit world, developers, and they were crafting recommendations on what to do about the large number of demolitions. And the neighborhood groups caught wind of this. Historic preservation advocates caught wind of this, and they invited themselves to these meetings, and they started showing up in large numbers. So originally it was, I don't know, maybe a subcommittee of 20 people. There were some meetings that by kind of at its peak dysfunction, there were probably like 40 some people that showed up total, and they were kind of hijacking the meeting. And so then city staff had to kind of retreat and figure out rules. And so if you had a name card, you could sit at the table and you were an official member, but since it was a public meeting, other people could be there. They ended up saving 5 minutes at the end of the agenda for kind of this extra gallery of people to air their grievances. And it was a mess for a while. And it all ended up turning out okay in the end. So everybody, had a common understanding and everyone's voices were represented. but it was painful to get there. So move from 2014 to 2015, one of the outcomes of that initial kind of subcommittee and recommendation was that they made some changes. They recognized that deconstruction was an important alternative to mechanical demolition. They said we want to table that for this conversation, but there's something there, and we think additional work should continue on it. So our city council directed our Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, to form our own advisory group and come back to them with recommendations on how to advance deconstruction. So having just come off of that previous experience and watching, people not be at the table and get offended and tempers flare, I was like, okay, we need to make sure we have everybody at the table, even if they're not going to be friendly. Like, we need both sides of the issues here, and let's hammer it out. So we formed a deconstruction advisory group in April of 2015, and pretty much from the get-go, we had the neighborhood advocates there. We had the home builders and the Home Builders Association there, developers. We had deconstruction contractors, so both for and nonprofit, salvage retailers, both for and nonprofit, historic preservation advocates, which I'll kind of highlight as, sometimes people don't think of deconstruction as a historic preservation tool, but it is increasingly looked at as a tool in the historic preservationist toolbox. Not initially, but later on, we added a hazardous material professional from our county government that focused on lead paint. From the beginning, we had our city's permitting department, so that, anything you cook up in an advisory group, eventually you're going to have to implement. And so we had them as part of that group from the beginning. And then we had a representative from that subcommittee that had been formed the previous year. We brought somebody over to represent from that original subcommittee. So in terms of what that meant and the difference it made, I mean, I can't emphasize enough the importance of having all the voices in the room from the very beginning. You end up asking, the tough questions get asked, and they're answered in that room. So we had, 22 people, about 22 people on our advisory group. We met once a month roughly for almost 2 years, and we had conversations in that room that were challenging, they were painful, they were educational. But we got to air all that in a little conference room in a building. And by the time we got to city council, it was like, all we'd done the dress rehearsal. We knew what the hard questions were. We knew what the answers were. We had educated our neighborhood advocates on, kind of the economics of construction and where there was room for navigation and where there wasn't. The builders understood the concerns of the neighborhood groups, and eventually we got to common ground. We got to literally a unanimous support for the policies that we put forward. And I mean, there was a meeting in December of 2015 that, we posed a question like, hey, we want to do this policy. Is everyone in agreement? We went around the room, and even though it wasn't a voting body, we said, does everyone agree with this? And everybody did. The builders agreed, the neighborhood advocates agreed. And I think having those conversations, having compromises. I mean, I can point to, if I called up our deconstruction ordinance on the computer right now, I could point to probably 7 places in our ordinance that were the direct outcomes of feedback from the development community that ultimately helped that ordinance be successful, and it's one of the reasons it's endured for going on 7 years this October.
Nice. Well, congratulations on that. That is the gist of it right there, is I think, in what you did there, and the reason it's holding together nicely, and it got so well adopted. So, and the beauty of those cantankerous questions that got asked is that you didn't have to ask them.
All right.
Okay.
True.
So, yeah, thanks for that, Shawn. So Ted, what are some of the advantages of deconstruction? You've touched on this a little bit, but financially, socially, and environmentally over demolition, and along that same line, what are some of the dangers of demolition that deconstruction replaces?
Well, we've already talked about what the financial was for both parties, both the donating or giving party and the receiving and buying party. But certainly environmentally, the first comes up: where do we put our next landfill when the ones we've got are full? We've got a lot of newbies, not in my backyard. Okay, well, we're here in California. Gee, there's a big state to the east of us called Nevada with a lot of land, and maybe we could go over there and poach some and put some landfills in. That becomes a real problem. An example, in Connecticut, there are no construction and demolition C&D landfills in the state of Connecticut. All C&D materials are exported from Connecticut to other states, particularly Pennsylvania and Ohio. Actually, some even wind up in Canada.
Wow.
So this becomes a real problem from an environmental standpoint. The others are various things like just dust control. An excavator coming in, bulldozer coming in, explosions. There's a lot of dust, be that dust good dust or bad dust. Bad dust meaning there's some elements in there that are not conducive to health. But nonetheless, it's pretty profound, the amount of pollution that can be put in the air. And frankly, with deconstruction, we're saving so much of that material, and it's not causing a lot of dust. And anything that has to be mitigated before deconstruction is already taken care of. And I can guarantee you that in demolition, they still, no matter how much might have been abated, there's still some that is missed, and that can be a big problem. So the environmental side is quite clear. And then on top of that, and I brought it up a couple of times, is just the embodied energy. The embodied energy that is being saved in those materials. The Forest Products Laboratory, I mentioned them earlier, out of Wisconsin. They're a department of the USDA. Many years ago, probably 10, 15 years ago, did a study on the amount of energy used in virgin material versus reused material. And I had originally thought that the numbers would be probably 2 or 3 times more for the more energy in the virgin. But as it turned out, that study showed anywhere between 11 and 13 times more energy was consumed in virgin material than it was in the deconstructed and salvaged materials.
Wow.
And as we know, lumber has one of the lowest embodied energies components of all materials within a building. You talk about any of the metals and so forth, those are extractive industries. Those are very, very heavily concentrated in embodied energy. So that's the other savings is the embodied energy, and of course the carbon content, as Shawn has brought up, and that's his specialty, and he's doing a much deeper dive into that. So anyway, that's what we see as the benefits to deconstruction, beyond those of just making sense to reuse something.
Right. Right. Wow. Okay. Well, that's quite a list. That's a good list too. Thank you. And when you mentioned transporting, waste up to Canada, as far away as Canada from Connecticut, well, that has a carbon impact too.
Oh,
Wow.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, thanks for that, Ted. Shawn, back to you. And back to the policy process, and one of the fears of those who would put their hands up and say, no, 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 we don't want that, is that they seem to think it has to all happen at once. So does it have to happen all at once, Shawn? Does all building demolition stop, come to a screeching halt, and then deconstruction take over from there? Or how does that actually work?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and kind of almost similar to maybe the last one before that, losing track. It's like that almost, that sounds easier, right? Like, let's just require deconstruction for everything.
Yeah.
And, well, we did it. And it, that might sound good on the front end, but in the long run, it's going to come back to bite you. And there's some examples of that out there, but yeah, to answer your question directly, no, it should not happen all at once, in my opinion. And I'll go back to our deconstruction advisory group, and I think there was probably a point, so rewind to 2015, there's probably a point where I was like, yeah, let's just require it for everything. That sounds great. It's so much better, right? We just heard Ted talk about the advantages. It's so much better than mechanical demolition on so many counts. Why wouldn't we be doing this, right? We put our cans out at the curb for recycling, and we drop things off at Goodwill for donations and reuse, but we throw away our whole houses. So it seems kind of nuts. But going back to our advisory group, again, diverse set of perspectives and different stakes in the game, opposite ends of the spectrum in some cases. So we had neighborhood groups that were definitely in the camp of let's require deconstruction for everything, and then we had our building community that was like, yeah, deconstruction is a good thing, it just costs more and takes longer, so do something in the market that'll make it a closer fit to mechanical demo, and we'll totally do it, but don't make us do it.
Right.
And our deconstruction contractors, I think, and our salvage retailers were kind of, they didn't know where they wanted to land. They're hearing, if you own a business or have a nonprofit that is focused on salvaging building materials, whether you're deconstructing or selling it, all of a sudden you're hearing this conversation about, hey, we might require this. We might totally inject tons of work into the system. Part of you is probably like, oh, this is fantastic. This is going to be great for business. This is going to be great for our mission. But it was actually our developers that at one point, when we were talking about requirements, neighborhood folks are like, do it for everything. And, initially the builders were like, no, don't require it. But there was literally a meeting where one of the builders was like, actually, I think we should require it for everything. Require it for everything. And he was being kind of tongue in cheek, because he's like, if you do that, if you require it for everything, from day one, your deconstruction industry is not going to have enough labor to actually do the work, right? The building industry couldn't get enough drywallers to hang drywall, so we're going to have this whole new industry for the most part, and you wouldn't be able to do it. So there'd be long timelines to get deconstruction done. There'd be a glut of materials in the market, so we'd go from a handful of houses coming down a year to, at the time, would have been like 350 houses coming down in a year. So you'd have tons of material. The value of that material would drop because you've oversupplied the market, and the whole thing would fail. One of the one of the economics of deconstruction is, this is going to cost a lot of money in terms of labor because it's very labor intensive. And one of the ways to offset that cost is in the value of the materials. So if we had required deconstruction for everything, they wouldn't be able to make up some of that labor cost with the value of the materials. So, and that's when our deconstruction and salvage retailers were like, oh, actually, we know where we want to be. We do not want to be in the let's do this for everything. They agreed with the developers. It's like, no, we need to be someplace, on the spectrum of all or nothing. And so that's where it was kind of, it was like the city's job to figure out, okay, what does that look like? Let's balance perspectives. Let's do something that, really advances this without overwhelming it. So we called it like bold but balanced. And ultimately we took a phased approach. So we started off with a grant program. And then when we moved into requirements, we took an approach of let's take a portion of overall demolitions and require deconstruction for that. So we set a year built threshold of 1916 or earlier. So if the house was built in 1916 or earlier, so this would have been 100 years old or older back in 2016, or if it was historic, regardless of age. So again, kind of going back to our historic preservation stakeholders, that was a nod to them. So if it met that age range or it was historic, it had to be deconstructed. And what that translated to is 1/3 of house demolitions were required to be deconstructed. So of those house demolition permits, 1/3 had to be deconstructed. And we supported workforce development and contractor training as a way to build that industry up. Our grants program kind of overlapped with our deconstruction ordinance. And then 4 years later, we raised that year built threshold to 1940. And so that's where it's at now. And that captures 2/3 of house demolition permits annually. So we went from a handful to 1/3 to 2/3. So that's over the course. So that was, 4 years, but we're getting close to 7 years into this. And we've fundamentally changed how houses come down in Portland. So I would just say slow and steady wins the race.
Gotcha. Well, that was a content-rich answer, Shawn. I knew it. I knew there would be some stuff lurking in there, but that was excellent. Thanks. In the interest of time and the fact that we have covered most of what would be the next question, for Ted, I'm going to slip a question in that's in our Q&A from one person and get a little jump on that. We've got questions from Daniel Hartzig and from Madison Krause, and the one from Daniel Hartzig would work well for Ted because he's mentioned in this. And the question is, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, tried to implement a carbon copy of the Portland Deconstruction Ordinance without sufficient deconstruction contractors and/or salvage reuse economy of any significant size in the area. As a result, the ordinance failed. As Ted noted, a circular economy requires all cylinders firing at the same time to keep it moving. Is there a way to baby step to a successful decon ordinance? How do we build demand and capacity first? Thanks, Daniel. Ted?
It's a good point. I like Shawn's last explanation. First of all, let's go back, and Shawn has mentioned them. He mentioned two, but there's really three detriments to deconstruction immediately in any city, in any county, throughout the country. One is money. It costs more. From a nonprofit standpoint, we think we've, at least for our customers and donors, we've solved that problem because of the tax benefit. Number two is time. Much of that has been mitigated because if we can get cities, and we've gotten a lot of them in California, to have the owner or contractor be able to separate the demolition permit or deconstruction permit from the building permit.
Yep.
So that while the building permit is being reviewed and going through zoning and public comment and so forth, the deconstruction can happen, and consequently the building will be ready when the new plans have been approved. So that tends to eliminate or at least mitigate a substantial portion of the time. But the third one is now the one that's raising its head throughout the country, and that is, what do we do with these materials? Where do they go? You know, to do it on a step-by-step basis is okay to an extent. There still has to be room to be able to expand. For instance, we've got 40,000 square feet in Oakland, and we need another 30 or 40,000 square feet to satisfy the demand. It's quite important that the cities realize, and this is the beautiful place for the public private partnerships, either with nonprofit or for-profit organizations in the local city or counties, to be able to provide some type of rent incentive for organizations. Let's face it, deconstruction is only a major problem. Well, it's a problem everywhere, but the biggest one is in large cities. In large cities is where the action is. Large cities is where the growth is. In large cities is where the high rents are. Consequently, the cost to run a reuse facility is almost impossible if one is to keep those materials, again, not the architectural salvage type stuff, which garners lots of money, and but it's, what do we do about lumber and single glazed windows and hollow core doors? You know, there is a market for those, and the ability to display those and put those out for a retail customer takes a lot of real estate.
Absolutely.
You know, as an example, we brought in a truckload a year ago out of Colorado, a couple of years ago, I should say. It was strictly a remodel. It's a 3,000 square foot house. All the interior components of that house, not the framing, it was just a remodel, but the entire contents of that house fit in a 52 foot trailer, like a big, huge moving van.
Right.
It was brought to our facility, and that takes up about 400 square feet, a little larger than 400 square feet. Now, that's not the selling floor. That's how it was all compacted within the trailer. Within that trailer, there are 12 different categories of materials: doors, windows, cabinets, sinks, plumbing fixtures, electric fixtures, floor tile, etc. So there's 12 different categories. If each of those categories needs a display section or a retail area for people to view it, that means you need aisles. So each one of those needs its own aisle, almost 360 degrees around it, to be able to see the materials. So all of a sudden, that 400 square feet has now just blossomed into 1,000 to 2,000 square feet for one house. And now we're talking 100 houses, 200 houses, 300 houses a year. That's a substantial amount of square footage. And just to build up through a series of 4 or 5 or 6 years into that size and that capacity is probably not, from a retail standpoint, is not a good model.
Right.
Because you have to change your location every 2 or 3 years to expand, and consequently the rents are going up.
Exactly. Yeah.
So there needs to be a place for the cities to realize, hey, we can pass these ordinances either step by step or as Palo Alto did, all at once, and but it doesn't matter. We still have to make some arrangements for where these materials are going, and recognize that we're not trying to save the Wedgwood stove and the clawfoot bathtub, but we're trying to save all these other utilitarian type materials.
That's a good way to put it. Save the utilitarian type, because they're the larger masses of things. Yeah.
Obviously, yeah.
Yep. So thank you. That answers Daniel's question. So we'll move right into the Q&A now. because we've chatted a little over our time, and
That's my fault.
no, it's nobody's fault. No, so we had allowed for that. So anyway, there's two more good questions. The first came in from Madison Krause, who is of the city of Detroit in their recycling department, and Maddie asks, can you talk a bit about the types of infrastructure required to capture diverted C&D waste? Often we see developers want to divert construction waste to achieve LEED LEED certification, but there is nowhere to take large quantities of materials. And so that, from Madison in Detroit, goes right along with what you were just saying, Ted. So do you care to expand on that just a bit?
Sure. We've opened about 4 stores in 6 stores in 5 cities. Mm-hmm. In our 30 years, and some of those were our stores. Others we were brought in as a consultant to help them start up. We see a minimum of 10,000 square feet under roof, with about 5,000 square feet of lumber yard plus parking. Mm-hmm. That's kind of a minimum. If anybody wants to start with less than that, they're probably kidding themselves.
Yeah, good luck.
And as I say, right now we've got 40,000 square feet, and we're still behind the 8 ball on square footage. We just need more.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you. And Shawn, I would send this over to you, but it is specifically for Ted from Sandy Rada. And Sandy asks for Ted, what type of appraisal do you use for the donations, personal property or in place?
It's all personal property. In place is a real estate appraisal. Our materials are personal property. They have been detached from the underlying real estate. Even in house moving, which we have done a lot of in Texas. We've got one of our representatives down there has done, I don't know, 40, 50 house moving projects. We've done a couple up in the Bay Area. But once the house is detached from the real estate, it's now personal property, like a mobile home.
Right.
But it's not. It's a stick-built house that has just been raised up.
Okay. Huh. Interesting point. I raised a house up once and moved it about 3 inches, but still moved the darn thing. So that is not a uncomplicated process. It's hard work, but it's also a great alternative. We're almost out of time here. Since I don't see, I do see one more question here in the chat, and two more. One from Simone Chupin, and Simone is in Chicago, and you mentioned lead. How do you deal with potentially hazardous material? So, Shawn, you want to take that one?
Sure. And again, keep in mind, I worked for a local jurisdiction, so I wasn't out in the field doing this, but we certainly knew that both lead paint and asbestos were real hazards. And our deconstruction contractors, as part of their certification and training, we required them to have lead paint training and certification, as well as asbestos inspector, which is the lowest credential for asbestos, so that they knew how to safely remove the lead and what precautions to take, what personal protection equipment to wear. In terms of the asbestos, we weren't expecting them to remove that. An asbestos abatement company would do that, but the fact that they were trained in it and could potentially recognize suspect asbestos material allowed them that, they pulled a cabinet off and there was some sort of laminate flooring, and they're like, whoa, that looks like it might be asbestos. Work stops. The abatement company comes out, removes it. That would never happen in a mechanical demolition. So that material is going to end up, if it goes to a recycling facility, it's going to get on a sort line and workers are going to be exposed to it. So anyway, we made sure our contractors were trained in that. And then an evolution of our deconstruction requirement, you know, since we were doing such a good job, but only a subset of demolition permits, eventual legislation came through that required more oversight on lead paint and asbestos for mechanical demolitions, and that ended up raising the cost to mechanically demolish, which was kind of a good thing for deconstruction because their cost didn't go up. Anyway, I could literally talk all day about that one, but in the interest of time.
Right. So as you say, in the interest of time, keeping it to our clock of hitting the hour straight up here in about a minute and a half. We've gotten in the last minute or so 4 more questions. So thank you for those. We're not going to get to all those, but I have copied them down, and I will see what I can answer in the outbound message that goes out to everybody after this. So thank you for those questions. And we all appreciate those. And let me just wrap it up here because we want to keep on time because people got things to do. So yeah, our purpose with the Deconstruction Policy Accelerator, the DPA, is obviously to help cities and counties create and implement well-crafted, effective policy for long-term solution to this huge problem of construction and demolition waste. And so, what Shawn has done in Portland, what Ted has done in Palo Alto and elsewhere. We can't cover it all in one webinar. So thank you for the questions. We'll be following through with this with a monthly newsletter with some specific information about creation of such policies and all across America. We're also hosting an educational series that will be ongoing of the webinars and then workshops and boot camps to engage with us, ReCapturit, in this the DPA. So stay tuned on that. And then lastly, I just want to thank my friends, my colleagues, Ted Reif and Shawn Wood, and what a great job you guys have done today. And I learned stuff, and I took a whole page of notes just while I was running this thing. So thank you for that. Thank you, all of you, for attending here. Your interest in sustainability and in this specific topic of reusing buildings and building materials is noted and appreciated immensely because it's an important thing. So spread the word. See you at the next webinar, workshop, or boot camp soon. And remember that waste is not waste until it's wasted. So thanks, Ted. Thanks, Shawn. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate you being here.
Thank you, Larry. Thanks, everyone, for being here.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Carol.
All righty.